The tin roof crackled above her like a warning. December wind scraped through the wooden barracks of Camp Hearn, Texas, and Lotte Fisher pulled her knees tighter against her chest, wrapping thin arms around a body that felt smaller by the day. Just outside, American boots stomped past in rhythm. But inside the barracks, there was no sound, only the quiet, tense silence of captured women. Then came the moment no one expected. A tin was passed through the doorway. No threats, no commands, just a label that read, "Strawberry Preserves." Lotte stared at it like it was a grenade wrapped in gold. The women didn't move at first. It felt like a trap, something that sweet, that vibrant, that un-German did not belong in this place of rationed rice and powdered eggs. Lotte had learned how to suppress hope. Her father's silence from the Eastern Front taught her that. Her mother's slow death from malnutrition in Munich taught her more. And yet here it was, this strange American gift, soft, sticky, glistening red. The tin was placed in the center of a rickety table, as if it were some sacred offering. Even the guards outside looked away, pretending not to notice the ritual unfolding. When Lotte finally stepped forward, her hands trembled. The woman who opened the tin had short gray hair and a scar beneath one eye. She had once interrogated prisoners herself. Now she gently peeled back the metal lid with the delicacy of someone unwrapping a wound. A burst of scent filled the air, thick and impossibly alive. The room held its breath. Lotte couldn't stop staring at it. She hadn't seen real strawberries since before the war, maybe since before she knew what war was. The smell alone made her feel dizzy, like something was reawakening in her gut that she'd long since buried. Someone passed her a broken corner of cornbread, and she dipped it slowly into the preserve. The moment it touched her tongue, she forgot who she was. She forgot the flag she had once saluted, the lies she had whispered in school assemblies, the cold concrete of bomb shelters. All of it dissolved under that taste. It was sweet and wild, like running barefoot through the orchards of Bavaria, like her brother's laughter before the draft, like her mother's hands covered in sugar dust. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. For the first time in years, she remembered what it was to be a girl, not a soldier's sister, not a prisoner of war, just a girl with sticky fingers and the taste of summer in her mouth. They hadn't spoken aloud. Not really. Not since the tin was placed on the table. It was as if words might shatter the spell. The preserve glowed in the weak light, its red glisten softening the edges of the barracks, the splintered wood, the iron-framed cots, the sagging wire mesh of the windows. Even the dust in the air seemed to hold still. Lotte watched as one of the older women, Anna, slowly reached for the knife. Her fingers were stained from laundry soap, her nails bitten to the quick, yet she held the blade like it was crystal. No one dared to rush her. The others leaned forward, breathless. Some were girls like Lotte, no more than 16, their uniforms traded for coarse US-issued dresses. Others were women who had marched in parades, sung patriotic songs, and now sat here with hair pinned back in quiet defeat. The knife touched the jam, slicing through it with such reverence that it made Lotte ache. Anna dabbed a small amount onto a scrap of bread and passed it to the woman beside her. That woman did the same. It moved like that one to the next, slow and sacred. No one took more than they should. No one dared. Lotte counted the hands. There were 19 women in the barracks that morning. The tin was enough for maybe 12 small servings. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. When her turn came again, when the preserve reached her for the second time, she could see the bottom of the tin glinting through. She stared for a moment. Just a thin layer left. It felt wrong to take more. And yet her hand moved. She scraped the edge, careful not to waste a single shimmer of fruit. She didn't even use bread this time. She just licked the knife clean, eyes closed, ashamed of the pleasure. Behind her, someone giggled. Not cruelly, just softly. A strange sound. It caught on the air like a bird who forgot it wasn't free. Another laugh followed. Lotte turned. Two of the girls were holding up the tin like it was a mirror. One of them, Marta, smeared a bit on her nose and crossed her eyes. Lotte couldn't help it. She laughed. For the first time since the surrender, she laughed without permission. The others joined in, quietly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the room and bounced off the bare metal ceiling. For a moment, they were not prisoners. They were girls again. Hungry, humiliated, unsure but laughing. The kind of laughter that doesn't fix anything but reminds you that something inside you isn't dead yet. Outside, a guard paused at the door, curious at the sound, but he didn't enter, and Lotte was glad. He didn't belong in that moment. That moment was theirs, and it began with a tin of jam. Back in Bavaria, jam was never just jam. It was ceremony. It was pride. It was something mothers made in the summer and rationed like diamonds through the winter. Lotte remembered the way her mother would stir the bubbling pot with one hand and wave flies away with the other, sweat on her brow, a smile on her lips. Strawberries were rare even then, and sugar rarer still. When the war began, everything sweet began to vanish, first from the shops, then from the kitchens, then from the memory. The last jar of strawberry jam her family ever made was in the summer of 1941. Lotte remembered it clearly because her mother had sealed it with a thick layer of wax and tucked it behind the flour tin like a secret. "We'll open it on Christmas," she'd whispered. "If we make it." They did, and on that freezing December morning, her father, still in uniform, still smiling back then, had placed the little jar on the table like a trophy. Lotte was 12. Her brother was already at military school. Her mother unwrapped the wax, and the scent hit them all like a punch to the chest. One spoonful each, no more. She had licked the inside of her spoon for 10 minutes, closing her eyes, pretending it would last longer. That taste, bright, sun-warmed, alive, had become a kind of ghost in her mouth. Over time, she stopped dreaming about it. It felt too dangerous. Sweetness meant softness, and softness got people killed. Then came the Hunger Years. By 1943, even the word jam had turned bitter. What Germans called jam now was mostly beet syrup or thickened carrot paste, sweetened with chemicals and spread like glue across black bread. No fruit, no sugar, just the illusion of plenty. Lotte's school had once served plum jam on Fridays, a single teaspoon, part of the Führer's promise of strength through nutrition. But even that stopped. What replaced it were slogans, marches, boiled cabbage, and silence. Food became punishment. Hunger became loyalty. Now, sitting in this dusty American camp, staring at the last glint of red on a dull spoon, Lotte felt the full weight of those lost years press against her chest. This jam was not like the German paste. It was real, sticky, sweet, careless. It reminded her of before the air raids, before the conscriptions, before the betrayals. It reminded her of her mother's humming voice and the sun warming the stone steps outside their old kitchen, of her brother stealing extra tastes and swearing her to secrecy, of a country she no longer recognized, and a girl she wasn't sure still existed. She swallowed the last trace of preserve on her spoon and closed her eyes. The memory hurt more than the hunger ever did, because now she knew exactly what she'd lost. Lotte didn't want to eat it too fast. She didn't even want to blink. The little smear of jam on her stale cornbread looked like a sunset trapped on dry earth, glowing red-orange, softened by steam rising from a tin mug nearby. Her fingers shook as she brought it to her mouth. It had been so long since food felt like a moment. Most meals in the camp were forgettable, designed not to nourish but to survive. Rehydrated eggs, lumpy porridge, bitter greens boiled until their color bled out. Everything tasted like surrender. But this was something different. Not a ration, not a command, not even a punishment, just jam, and it made no sense. The cornbread crumbled a little as she bit into it. Her teeth pressed through the gritty texture and found the preserve beneath soft, cold, impossibly alive. The sweetness exploded on her tongue like a memory waking from a coma. There was no warning, no gentleness, just sudden flavor, real strawberries, not chemical lies, sugar that tasted like sunlight. Lotte froze, her eyes watered. She chewed slowly, afraid the moment would vanish too fast. She barely noticed her bunkmate beside her, whispering a prayer under her breath. All she could do was sit there, tasting. The flavor made her angry, not because it was bad, it was perfect, but because it had been hidden from her for so long, because her country had chosen bombs over berries, conquest over comfort, lies over jam. She had believed it all, the speeches, the promises, the glory, but none of that had ever touched her soul like this spoonful of sweetness. What kind of power could create something so gentle? What kind of people handed this out to enemies? She didn't understand. She only knew that this was the first time in years that food had made her feel something. Not just full, not just fed, seen. Across the table, Marta let out a soft moan and covered her mouth, embarrassed. Another girl grinned, wiping a red smear from her chin like lipstick. Someone giggled. Another woman, older, folded her hands and closed her eyes like she was in church. No one said much. They didn't have to. The jam had spoken for them. It was the kind of food that told you the war was over, even if it wasn't. That you were still human, even if no one had called you that in months. That you were alive, even if you didn't know what for. Lotte wiped her fingers on her dress and stared at the empty spoon. She wanted more. Not just more jam, more feeling. More reminders that life had colors and sweetness, and surprises that didn't come with a uniform. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a girl again, hungry, yes, but for something far deeper than food. It began with one laugh. A small, breathy snort from Marta, who had always been the most serious among them. She had once slapped another girl for humming too loudly during roll call. But now, with a faint smear of jam still on her bottom lip, Marta leaned back against the wall and laughed like someone remembering a joke from another life. Lotte turned toward her, startled, and saw the corners of her own mouth curl before she could stop them. Then another laugh joined in. Then another, not wild or hysterical, but quiet, stunned, like a muscle being used for the first time in years. It spread through the barracks, like a ripple in still water. Women who hadn't spoken in days exchanged glances. Someone mimed sipping tea with pinky raised. Another held the jam tin like it was a rare perfume, wafting the scent toward her nose with exaggerated elegance. It was absurd, and it was perfect. For that brief stretch of morning, the gray shell of Camp Hearn transformed. The bunks still creaked, the air still stung of cold and rust, but the energy inside was different. Not soft, never soft, but loosened, like a fist unclenching. Even the light seemed warmer as it spilled in through the high, grimy windows. It touched the women's faces as they smiled, and it made them look younger. Not by years, but by something deeper, by what war had stripped from them, and the jam had, if only for a moment, returned. Lotte found herself remembering old games, ones she'd played with her brother in the orchards behind their house before the draft took him. She remembered laughing so hard her stomach hurt, back when laughter had been the currency of childhood, not defiance. Here, it felt dangerous to laugh too loud, to look too joyful. What if someone came in and punished them for it? What if the gods thought they were mocking? But none came. No one yelled. No orders were barked. The guards stayed outside, likely hearing the strange chorus of giggles and choosing to leave it be. Or perhaps they understood. Later, Lotte sat cross-legged on her cot, fingers still faintly sticky, and tried to memorize every detail of the moment. The sound of the laughter, the way Marta's face softened when she let go, the trembling in her own chest that came not from fear but from relief. She didn't know how long this would last. Maybe the Americans would stop giving them jam. Maybe tomorrow the war would find them again. But today, they had stolen back a piece of themselves. And for just a little while, the barracks smelled like strawberries and joy. No one mentioned rations, no one cried, and no one, not even the hardest women among them, dared to call it weakness. That night, long after the tin had been scraped clean and the laughter faded into the quiet creaks of sleeping bodies, the question settled like a weight on Lotte's chest. Why did they give this to us? She stared at the ceiling, tracing the jagged seam of the metal roof with her eyes, listening to the wind rattle through the cracks. The jam had been real, that much was certain. The sweetness still lingered faintly on her tongue, but the gesture, that was the part that made her stomach twist. It didn't feel like something enemies were supposed to do, and in war, nothing ever came without reason. She had spent years being told what Americans were: weak, greedy, soulless. Their food was poisoned, their soldiers cowards, their women shameless. That was the story fed to them in the League of German Girls, repeated like gospel in smoky classrooms and shouted through tinny radios. The enemy had no soul, and yet today, one of those soulless guards, a boy no older than her brother, had placed the tin in her hands and said, simply, "Merry Christmas." No sneer, no malice, just that. She hadn't known what to say, so she had said nothing and stared at him like he was speaking a different language. Maybe he was. Lotte rolled onto her side and stared at Marta's sleeping back. Her thoughts spun faster than she could slow them. What if this was some kind of trick, a way to soften them? To make them drop their guard? A few of the older women thought so. They had refused to touch the jam, sitting rigidly by the door, watching the rest with narrowed eyes. One had muttered, "First jam, then questions." Another scoffed and said, "They want us to beg." Lotte didn't believe that, or she didn't want to. Still, the thought gnawed at her. Kindness could be used as a weapon too. She wrapped the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering more from unease than cold. What unsettled her most wasn't the sweetness itself, but how much she had liked it. How easy it had been to forget, in those few minutes, the uniformed men with guns, the fences, the shame. How the jam had reached some part of her no speech or ideology ever could. It was dangerous, that kind of feeling. Dangerous to remember softness after years of hard edges. Dangerous to feel gratitude toward the hand that had locked the door behind you. But even as doubt festered, something stubborn inside her refused to turn the moment into a lie. Maybe it was real. Maybe the jam wasn't a bribe or a trick, but simply what it seemed to be: a gift. A strange, golden thread in the middle of a war-torn day. Lotte closed her eyes and held onto that thought, letting it wrap around her like a second blanket, warm and impossible. The next morning, the jam was gone, but the unease remained. The barracks felt quieter, tighter, like the walls had inched closer in the night. Even the sunlight slanting through the cracks looked suspicious, too golden, too soft. Lotte sat on her cot, watching the older woman named Ilse pace slowly near the stove. Ilse had been a schoolteacher before the war, strict and sharp-tongued, with a voice that cut like glass. She hadn't touched the jam, not even a finger dipped in curiosity. Now she stood with arms folded, her eyes tracing the faces of the younger girls, as if calculating the damage. "They want you tame," she said finally, voice low but firm. "You think that sweetness is mercy, but it's strategy. Sugar dulls the mind. You'll forget who you are." Lotte looked up, startled. The others shifted uncomfortably. Ilse's gaze was locked on her. "You laughed yesterday," she continued. "You forgot where we are." No one answered. No one argued. That was the trouble with women like Ilse, they weren't always wrong. Lotte stared at the floor, feeling heat rise in her throat. She wanted to scream that she hadn't forgotten, that she knew exactly where she was, that every breath in that place tasted of humiliation. But what if Ilse was right? What if that single spoonful had made her weak? Still, the memory didn't feel like weakness. It felt like rebellion, not against her country, but against despair, against the crawling numbness that threatened to make her forget she was human. And maybe that was the difference. Ilse clung to anger. Lotte clung to something softer, not forgiveness, but maybe the faint echo of it. Ilse kept talking. "They feed you jam today. Next week, it's questions. They'll want stories, details. They'll ask what you saw, what you believed, and you'll be so grateful for another taste, you'll give them anything." End quote. Marta finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. "They haven't asked for anything." "Yet," Ilse snapped. Lotte stood. She didn't know why. She wasn't even sure what she was going to say until the words were already out. Maybe they won't. Maybe they just gave it. Ilse scoffed. No one gives without wanting something. But Lotte wasn't convinced. She remembered the face of the American guard, not cruel, not soft either. Just tired, just human. He had handed her the tin like he didn't know what else to offer. And maybe that was the truth of it. Maybe the jam wasn't about power or peace or propaganda. Maybe it was one person reaching across a fence, not as enemy to enemy, but as human to human. She didn't say that. She just sat back down and stared at her hands. They still smelled faintly of strawberries. The hunger had been with her so long, it no longer made noise. It had settled deep in her bones, like an old injury that flared only when she forgot to brace herself. Lotte sat alone on the steps outside the barracks, her arms folded across her stomach, staring at the barbed wire fence in the distance. The sweetness was gone from her tongue now. No trace of jam remained. What lingered instead was the ache not for food, but for something she couldn't name. Something that didn't live in potatoes or powdered milk or boiled greens. Something she used to feel before her country turned every meal into a calculation of survival. She remembered the first time she'd gone a day without eating. It was the winter of 1942, and the train had been delayed by snow. She and her mother sat in a freezing station with nothing but a slice of bread between them. Her mother had split it in half. Lotte had cried when she noticed her mother pretending to chew with an empty mouth. That memory returned now with sharpness, cutting through the numbness she'd built like a shell. Back then, even the tiniest bit of food was sacred. But sweetness, that had been erased. As the war dragged on, flavor disappeared from German life, like color draining from a photograph. By 1944, sugar was something whispered about, traded for favors, smuggled in coats, hoarded like medicine. When she'd reached the camp after her capture, she had told herself to forget it altogether. Wanting sweetness was a weakness, a waste of hope. But then the jam had come, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. It had broken something open in her, stirred up feelings that had no place in a prisoner's body. Lotte pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth, hoping for a ghost of the flavor. Nothing, just salt and ash. That's what most food in the camp tasted like, flat, gray, meant to keep you alive and nothing more. The jam had betrayed that rule. It reminded her that food wasn't just fuel. It could be memory, emotion, a form of touch when no one touched. And that terrified her. Because once you remembered how it felt to taste joy, it made the absence unbearable. She felt it now, like a wound that throbbed in the quiet. Not a wound from the body, but from the soul, the part of her that had adapted to cruelty, to blandness, to survival. That part had been unprepared for sweetness, and now it was exposed, raw and restless. The wind picked up, and she pulled her jacket tighter. Somewhere inside the camp, a bell rang for inspection. But Lotte didn't move yet. She sat still, mourning the piece of herself that had awakened too early, too hungry for a world that no longer fed the heart. She wrote to him that night by the flicker of the low-watt bulb, its light barely strong enough to reach the paper. The pencil felt heavy in her fingers. Her brother, Lucas, had not written in months. The last letter came from the Russian front, folded and stained with something she tried not to name. He had written about the cold, the silence between gunfire, and the way the men had stopped talking about going home. She kept that letter under her pillow, as if the words alone could keep him breathing. Now, it was her turn to send something back, though what she had to offer felt embarrassingly small. Still, she pressed the pencil to the paper and began. "Lucas, you won't believe this." She paused, biting her lip. It felt stupid even writing it, but she continued. "The Americans gave us jam, real jam. Strawberry, thick and sweet, like the kind Mama used to make. I didn't know what to do with it at first. It felt like touching something sacred, and when I tasted it," her hand hesitated again. How did she explain what it felt like? Not the flavor anyone could describe sweetness, but the way it broke her open, the way it collapsed the walls she had built around herself, the way it made her feel like the war hadn't swallowed everything. She tried again. "It tasted like we won the war." She stopped. The words looked strange on the page, almost shameful. But she didn't cross them out. She let them stay, because for a moment it had felt that way. Not because they were winning, she knew they weren't, but because in that single bite she had remembered what peace could feel like. Not in treaties or silence or flags, but in the quiet miracle of sweetness shared among starving women. She told him about the laughter, about Marta's jam-covered nose, about the way Ilse watched them with a frown like stone. She didn't mention the shame that came after the whisper of guilt for enjoying what was given by the enemy. That part felt too complicated, or too personal. She ended the letter simply, "If you ever taste strawberries again, think of me." Lotte folded the paper slowly, holding it to her chest for a moment before sealing it. She didn't know if it would reach him. No one ever did. But the act of writing made her feel tethered, if only faintly, to a version of herself that wasn't just a number behind barbed wire. She lay back on her cot, the letter tucked beneath her thin pillow, and stared up at the ceiling. The jam was gone. Her brother might be too. But the words remained, and in the dark, they tasted almost as sweet. That night, the dream came uninvited. Lotte was back in her grandmother's garden in Würzburg. It was summer, a real one, the kind that draped itself over your shoulders and made you forget that winters ever existed. Bees hummed around the strawberry patch, fat and lazy, bumping into each other mid-air like drunk dancers. She was barefoot on warm stone, a wicker basket in hand, the scent of ripening fruit thick in the air. Her grandmother's voice echoed faintly, calling her to pick only the red ones, the soft ones, the ones that stained your fingers just by looking at them. In the dream, she reached down and plucked one. It was warm from the sun, swollen and heavy with juice. She bit into it, and the taste made her heart swell. Not because it was new, but because it was old, because it was something that once belonged to her. She closed her eyes and let the flavor hold her. Then, as dreams do, it changed. The stone path cracked, the sky darkened, the bees stopped. Her grandmother was no longer calling, and the garden twisted into something hollow. The strawberries turned pale. The sweetness on her tongue faded. She reached for another berry, but her hands were too small, too cold. The basket was gone, and suddenly she was kneeling not in a garden, but in the middle of the Texas barracks floor, holding an empty tin and weeping soundlessly. She woke with her face pressed into the pillow, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like it had somewhere to go. The taste was still in her mouth, not the real jam, but the dream of it. That was worse. It clung to her in a way the actual spoonful hadn't. She sat up slowly, blinking at the shadows around her. Most of the women were still asleep. A few muttered in their dreams. One cried softly into her blanket. Lottie swung her legs over the side of the cot and pressed her feet to the cold wooden floor. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the ache of memory. That dream garden had felt realer than anything she'd touched in weeks, maybe months, and now the barracks felt twice as empty. The laughter from the day before felt distant, as if it belonged to another girl entirely, someone softer, someone not trained to brace for silence. She whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood, not for release, not even for home, just for one more bite, not of jam, but of that feeling, that fleeting illusion that she still belonged to something sweeter than war. And as the first light crept across the floor, she wondered if longing could be more painful than hunger. A week passed before it happened again. Lotte had stopped hoping. The sweetness had become a ghost, something half remembered, half doubted, like a childhood song she wasn't sure she hadn't imagined. The laughter in the barracks faded back into habit. The girls moved with the same heavy rhythm, folding laundry, scrubbing latrines, eating their flavorless rations in silence. Even Marta, who had once smeared jam on her nose like rouge, went quiet. The memory hung in the air like a perfume long worn off. They never spoke of it. To mention it might confirm it had been a fluke, or worse, a trick. But on a grey morning, just before roll call, a rusted cart rolled into the mess hall with its usual clang of metal. Lotte didn't look up at first. She was peeling a boiled potato with her thumb, more out of boredom than hunger. Then she heard the sound. A tin being placed on the counter. Not soup, not beans. A different kind of sound, softer, rounder, a whisper of something delicate. Her head snapped up. And there it was. Another tin. This one was labeled apricot. She stood frozen. Around her, the others had noticed too. The shift was subtle, almost cautious. A few women exchanged glances. One whispered, "Again," but no one moved toward it yet. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. They had tasted joy once, and the ache of losing it had been sharp. Could they risk it again? Marta was the first to move. She walked slowly, without theatrics, and opened the tin with practiced care. This time, no gasps, no laughter. Just silence as the golden orange preserve was revealed. The scent rose, thick and floral, heavier than the strawberry. It reminded Lotte of sunlit windowsills and warm bread wrapped in cloth. But the mood was different now. There was no giddiness, no jokes, only gratitude, quiet, unspoken, almost holy. When Lotte took her portion, she did not smear it thickly. She took less. Just a small bit on the corner of her bread. She didn't need more. It wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about presence. The jam was still sweet, but this time she let it rest on her tongue like a secret. She closed her eyes and breathed through her nose. No tears came, only a stillness. She looked around. No one laughed. No one clapped. The women ate slowly, reverently, like something had shifted. They weren't girls chasing sweetness anymore. They were prisoners who had learned how to carry it quietly, like a coal hidden in the hand. And as Lotte licked the last trace from her fingers, She didn't feel like she was stealing joy. She felt like she was remembering it. In the corner of the mess hall, as spoons scraped gently against tin plates and the apricot sweetness lingered on their tongues, someone whispered, "Maybe this is how they forgive us." The words came from Greta, a quiet woman with sunken cheeks and tired eyes, who rarely spoke unless ordered to. Her voice was barely more than breath, but it landed with weight. A few heads turned. No one answered. The idea hovered above the table, like steam off hot tea, too delicate to touch, too strange to ignore. Lottie stared down at her crust of bread, now bare again. The sticky orange sheen had vanished, swallowed in 3 bites, but Greta's words stayed. Forgiveness. From the Americans. From the men behind the rifles. From the country that dropped pamphlets 1 month and sugar the next. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. Forgiveness was something you begged for, something you earned, something that came with confession and cost. But this was sweet and quiet and wordless. And that's what made it so confusing. Ilse would scoff, no doubt. She'd say this wasn't forgiveness, it was a softening, a trap. And Lotte understood why. When you've built your soul out of stone, anything tender feels like an attack. But she wasn't sure that was true anymore. What if this wasn't strategy? What if it was just humanity? The thought unsettled her more than she expected. Because if the enemy could offer sweetness without demand, without lecture, without cruelty, then what had all this suffering been for? What had she endured, obeyed, sacrificed, lied for? What had her brother bled for in the East? If kindness could come from the other side, then maybe the war wasn't just a clash of borders and uniforms. Maybe it was something deeper, something that had taken from everyone. Lotte glanced up at the American guard by the door. He wasn't watching them. He was looking at the floor, hands clasped behind his back, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. She wondered if he had a sister, if he had eaten jam with her on summer mornings before all this began. If he missed her, the thought made her chest tighten. Forgiveness. The word felt too big for a tin of apricot preserves, and yet it had done something. Not erased, not healed, but stirred, like a stone thrown into a frozen lake, cracking the surface just enough to remind the water it could move again. Lottie folded her hands and rested her head forward. She didn't pray. She just sat in the silence, letting the sweetness dissolve from her tongue and the question settle into her bones. What if the war didn't end with a surrender, but with a spoonful of something soft? Years later, long after the fences had rusted and the uniforms were folded away in attic boxes, Lotte found herself standing in her granddaughter's kitchen, holding a jar of jam. The label was different now, glossy, printed, American, organic, small batch. But the scent that rose when she opened the lid was the same. Strawberries, overripe and wild, clinging to summer. She dipped a spoon in slowly, her hand trembling just enough for the girl beside her to notice. "Are you all right, Oma?" the child asked. Lottie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "I was just remembering." She didn't tell her the whole story. Not about the wire fences or the iron bunks or the taste of powdered eggs scraped from dented cans. She didn't speak of the laughter that startled the guards or the silence that followed when the sweetness was gone. She didn't explain how a spoonful of jam once made a barracks of prisoners feel like girls again. Some things were too fragile to explain or too sacred. But later, when the kitchen quieted and the girl had gone to play, Lotte sat alone at the table and let herself remember the full weight of it. That first tin, the way the jam had looked in the light glistening like it didn't belong to war at all, the way her fingers had trembled as she brought it to her lips, the way her body didn't know whether to rejoice or mourn when the sweetness hit her tongue. She remembered Marta's laugh and Greta's whisper about forgiveness, and the way Ilse's frown seemed to deepen every time joy dared to creep into the room. Most of all, she remembered the silence that followed, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't want to ruin it. It had been their secret, their small rebellion, their proof that they had not been turned to stone. Lottie dipped her finger into the jar and tasted the jam again. It was good, perhaps even better than the one they had been given at Camp Hearn. But it didn't make her cry. Not this time, because she had carried that first taste with her all her life, not on her tongue, but somewhere deeper. A sweetness she never expected, a mercy she didn't ask for, a wound that healed strangely, quietly, without permission. She had never looked at jam the same way again. And sometimes, even now, when the world felt cold or her past crept too close, she would open a jar and sit in silence and remember what it meant when your enemy gave you something beautiful and you dared to receive it. If this story moved you, subscribe for more forgotten truths from the other side of the war.